Welcome to TFR Let's Talk. I'm your host, Swapnil Bhartiya, and we have two guests on our show, Jonathan Schneider, co-founder and CEO of Moderne, and Olga Kunjic, co-founder of Moderne. Jonathan, Olga, it's great to have you on the show.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Great.
Tell me a bit about the company. What problem, challenge that you see in the space that you wanted to solve and you created this company?
We see a lot of the cloud native software has changed how we develop software in the past decade. And right now, instead of building application from scratch, we kind of assemble it out of third-party dependencies, and a lot of maintenance becomes really hard because developers have to keep sort of restitching their applications out of this open source and third-party vendor dependency that they integrate. So we saw how tedious, but also how repeatable this problem was. So we took the technology that Jonathan developed early in his time at Netflix, which was used internally to upgrade APIs, and we expanded its capabilities in the last year significantly. So the whole framework migrations are now possible in CVE patching in automated way.
Jonathan, if you can share your experience, as she said, from the Netflix days that you brought there, you saw this problem that you wanted to address.
Sure. There at Netflix, we had thousands of repositories, source repositories, which is really common, especially given the microservices movement that we see a lot of different source code repositories. And when you wanted to affect some change across them, it could be very tedious and also difficult to go locate all the particular call sites that need to change and make that change. It's much bigger than just a search problem. It's a problem of how do I actually make the change and affect it. Luckily at Netflix, there was a freedom and responsibility culture, which meant there was a lot of different styles of code. So when we built a refactoring solution, we did it in a way where the suggested code changes that we make look idiomatically or stylistically consistent in the context of the project that it's inserted into. So it looks like a developer is handwriting the changes for each individual repository, even though they can be very different from one another. Now we go to a design partner and we say, look at one of your static analysis tools, a Sonar Cube, anything like that, and say, what is it reporting? And sometimes the scope of the suggested things to fix can be pretty large, hundreds or thousands of developer days worth of work. And we will develop recipes for those sorts of things that will automate the fix across the organization's code base.
Do you focus on a specific area? Because when I look at developers' workflow, there are so many things that they have to do.
I think if you go back 10 or 20 years, there was this concept of technical debt in our code. And technical debt then meant I didn't use the correct pattern, or I should have renamed something this way or that. Part of this move towards cloud native software delivery has also involved a change to industrialized software supply chain, where, as Olga mentioned, we're stitching together business applications out of a lot of third-party components. What that means is those things evolve independently of our release cycle, and now the developer is on the hook for keeping up with that sort of thing. We're still calling that technical debt, but it's a different form. It's not something that the developer imposed upon themselves. It's being foisted upon them from the outside. So this has become, we estimate 20 to 30% of developer effort is spent addressing this form of technical debt, which is really just software supply chain management activities masquerading as technical debt in the modern development ecosystem.
We just help developers automate these activities. So it's complementary to all of the investments that we've made already in our DevSecOps pipelines, sort of kind of help them speed it up and then leveraging all of those investments to automate promotion of the code into production.
You mentioned technical debt. Technical debt can be seen in so many different ways. You can fork a code and now suddenly you have maintaining your own version. One more thing that it could be closely associated with technical debt is also called tribal knowledge. Within an organization, a lot of people, they solve a problem in their own way. There is no standardization. There is nothing automated. Now, when those people move, they take that knowledge with them, and now the new team comes and they try to reinvent the wheel. How big is that problem, and how do you also address that as well?
This is such a great question. We talk to principal engineers and lead architects and lead developers all the time. And one thing we hear a lot, especially of the more senior folks, is they say, I feel like I'm going around telling everyone to pick up their socks all the time. I've identified something I don't want to see again. So now what we provide is the ability to develop a recipe that encapsulates that knowledge. So it's interesting. You start a change campaign with that encapsulated knowledge to to eliminate all the occurrences of some pattern you don't want to see anymore. And maybe you get that to zero, but then you can run that recipe in perpetuity to prevent that pattern from re-emerging in the organization as a developer goes out and copies and pastes something off a Stack Overflow, or they see something else somewhere, in another example. And so what you get is the more recipes you add, the more knowledge you encapsulate this way, the more you raise the bar of software quality inside your organization.
If you just look at the company, we talked about the problem and how you are addressing it. If you can talk about the solutions that you are offering, either their products or services or SaaS, IS, talk about that.
Yeah, I think the technology, the refactoring technology is in open source, specifically to build a community around of contributors and people using recipes. And especially we feel like we have aligned interests with framework authors and security researchers for them to publish and distribute recipes that migrate their consumers and patch CVEs. And part of our solution is a SaaS offering that allows organizations to distribute these recipes across the large code bases that they have and kind of have collaboration features and change campaign management, etc., to help them. Like lots of organizations have accumulated vast amount of code, and kind of coordinating the distribution and code improvements is already also difficult.
So it's fantastic to be able to test a recipe on one repository and see a change. So I think one of our design partners was trying to move from JUnit 4 to 5. They had been working on it for 18 months and had migrated 20% of their unit tests from JUnit 4 to 5. On that one repository, they apply the migration recipe we had written, and they're done. So 5 minutes later, the remaining 80% of the code base was migrated. That was, an incredibly tedious amount of work done. So then once they see that on one repo, they think, how could I do this across my other 1,000, 10,000 repositories? And that's where the SaaS offering comes in and helps distribute that change across the organization. What I love about this company, and it's the way the company is structured, is that all these recipes, we will always put in Apache licensed repositories. Like Olga said, we want that aligned incentive with framework authors to write recipes. What we're here to help with is to distribute that change across the organization and make sure patterns don't reemerge.
Your solutions are also based on open write and open source, component there. Can you talk about what are the open source components you're using, and why did you pick open write there? What libraries are you using? What frameworks are you using? And not only how you're using these things, how you're giving back, because that is critical to any open source project.
Absolutely, yeah. So Open Rewrite is the main organization on GitHub where the core refactoring engine and all of our recipes live. So just Open Rewrite. Rewrite is the main repository. One of the ways we give back, we actually run a public form of the SaaS, and we've ingested to this point about 50 million lines of code of open source repositories from Spring, Microsoft, Apache projects, etc. And we apply our recipes regularly to those open source repositories and issue PRs to help them improve the quality of their code and move forward on versions as well. So that's something we're going to continue to do, is be a big source of fixes and PRs going into other open source repositories.
If you look at last year, because of the pandemic, a lot of companies, they rushed to cloud. They were like, their digital transformation journey was accelerated. Two things happened. Yes, a lot of companies rushed, but they also kind of rushed, kind of blindfolded. They did not know because not very strategically planned. Now that hangover period is kind of over. Now they are hitting the reality. So what do you see from the area that you are especially working on, as you mentioned? What are the challenges that they are facing, and how are you helping them to overcome those?
Things have accelerated, but this is not just in the past year. It's been a sort of in the past 10 years. Like again, we mentioned the software development becomes industrialized and not handcrafted, but assembled. And kind of gradually more and more changes are coming, and developers have to keep doing, including these changes. So I think this is a trend, and last year accelerated it, but it's been around for a while.
I think one thing that may be surprising is you look at, you hear automated migration, and you think the largest applicability of this would be to legacy applications that were running on-prem, maybe not in a cloud environment, lifting them up from struts to Spring Boot, or lifting them up from a very old version of something else. And while there is applicability to that, there's actually a stronger case to be made that a modern cloud native application requires automation at the source code level, because it's more likely to involve more open source components and third-party APIs that evolve at their own pace. So we asked an interesting survey question in a recent internal meetup of 200 developers. If you could no longer touch the code in your application, how long would it continue to function? 81% said less than 6 months. That was really surprising to me. If you'd asked me that question 20 years ago, I wouldn't have really understood the question. Of course, it doesn't accrue features automatically, but it keeps running as long as it's deployed somewhere. And that's not true anymore of a modern cloud native app. So that cost is going to be incurred one way or another. We build apps faster, but we also have to maintain them on a more regular basis. And so I think what we'll see is a good application of this to the more modern applications.
I mean, I think when it comes to cloud, it's not just about cloud native computing. A lot of other areas, automation is kind of becoming key. You cannot do without that. But if I ask you that, how further are we in the path of automating most of the things? Have we achieved most of it, and we are in the early phase, or we are like, hey, that's done, automation, almost everything is fully automated, that problem is solved, or you're like, hey, no, we are just getting started?
I feel like we're just getting started, and we really view this in language verticals. We're going to do Java really well. We're going to do Terraform really well. We do YAML really well. We do XML really well. And then you start layering things on top of that. I can auto-remediate GitHub action files. I can auto-remediate Circle CI files. We're adding a JavaScript, TypeScript language binding, a Python language binding, a .NET binding, a COBOL binding. We're not opinionated about this sort of thing. I think to do these kinds of things well, especially around auto-remediation, you have to take a really deep white glove treatment of each language, because each language has different idioms, different experiences that developers in that ecosystem demand, to have automation be something that's accepted. So I feel like we're just getting started.
I think if you look at the refactoring technology that's in open source, I think in the last year we really did build a lot of high-level building blocks. The recipes are composable. We validated them on pretty significant migrations, like we mentioned JUnit 4 to 5, Spring Boot 1 to 2, Java 8 to 11. So I think there's a lot of promise, and we know that this is 100% correct and style preserving. And from this point on, we just need to build more and more of these recipes.
Can you also talk about what kind of companies, organizations, or what are the use cases where your company is playing a role there?
Well, it's very interesting, has been, because we see that this is applicable to so many organizations, from very large enterprises to medium-sized technology organization to small startups. Even us, as a young startup, we leverage it quite extensively to refactor our own code. So because again, we're going back that everyone is restitching some sort of a business application from the same subset of open source and third-party vendor dependencies that need to be upgraded and tended to.
If I look at the company and I'll ask you, hey, what kind of roadmap you have for at least this year? Because we cannot even talk about 5 years in this, very, very volatile time. But if I ask you, hey, what is going to be the focus for you? What would that be?
I think we will continue to build refactoring recipes and extending into different languages. We working on TypeScript right now, as well as we are working with our design partners for whom we would like to bring the SaaS offering internally to their internal code bases.
When we work with a new design partner, what we want to see is just a list of problems they have, their top 5 or 10 things in code that they wish they could do away with, that they could improve, that they could move faster on. And what we want to do is tackle those 5 or 10 things, right away. Be done with it this year. And then there's a larger story of, now how do I, run this? How do I keep this going in perpetuity? How do I expand the set of changes that I want to be able to make on an ongoing basis? But we love solving concrete problems for the design partners that we work with.
Olga, Jonathan, thank you so much for taking time out today and talk about not only the company, but also one of the pressing problems that we are all facing, and how the company is helping refactoring a lot of things, moving developers into an automated pipeline. There are a lot of things that I want to talk about, so I would love to have you folks back on the show and continue this discussion. But thanks for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure joining you.